Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It is an honor to be part of this space, to be in conversation and collaboration. I hail to you from Toronto, Treaty 13. And with that, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I think when we are talking about bias, I think when we're talking about these complex conversations, they can be hard. And how do we acknowledge where we are sitting, where we are grounded in the land and the community in which we are in? And so I share to you a land acknowledgement from the place that I'm in, and I say, I acknowledge the land that I am standing on is the traditional territories of the nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations people. I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 within the Mississaugas of the Credit and Williams Treaty, and signed by multiple Chippewa bands. I also acknowledge all treaty people, including those who came here to Canada as migrants, either in this generations or generations past. And those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly displanted Africans, brought as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. And why this conversation is so critical and important to me and dear to my heart. I also was born in Guyana. And so I love coming together to share and dialogue about how we can challenge gender norms, gender stereotype. And so I want us to think about this. When we're challenging bias, when we're daring to change, how are we fostering and cultivating spaces of inclusivity for all women to thrive? Because the consequences of not inclusive, building inclusive spaces has a cost. And that cost can look like different things. And so before we even get started, I want us to consider when we're talking about bias, what are we actually talking about? So bias is prejudice in favor or against one thing or person or group of people compared to usually in ways that are considered to be unfair. Biases may be held by an individual, group, or institution and can have negative or positive consequences. And biases can be conscious or unconscious. So when you think of the ways in which biases show up, they can be so ingrained into the ways that we have been conditioned to see the world. Biases that are conscious show up in explicit ways in how we support the action to support or opposing a particular person in an unfair way because of allowing personal opinions to influence our judgment. And in the unconscious ways that bias shows up, it shows up in stereotypes. Our ability to categorize people in different categories based on maybe experiences that we may have had. And I want to challenge us as we're thinking about biases, as we're thinking about the ways in which they are shaped, where do they come from? What informs our biases, right? So when we're first born, when we have our gender, biases show up, right? It's informed by our first families. It's informed by our age. It's informed by media. It is informed by our school, our education system. It's also informed by the places and the people we surround ourselves with, our working environment, our faith, and our location, our social location in the world. All of these things influence the way we move and navigate world and spaces. And so that's so important for us to consider. And so I am so pleased when I think about biases, oftentimes I want to call us into conversation around our intent versus impact. And I want to draw on this quote from Dr. Andrea Davis, who says, regardless of the intent, What is seen, heard, and felt is our impact. And so this idea about impact, I want to centralize this theme as we're talking about bias, because wherever, regardless of how we come to our bias, what we need to also pay attention to is the impact that we have on others. And so this image really highlights that. Imagine if someone runs over your foot with a car. You don't want to hear in that moment, I didn't mean to run over your foot. I'm a good driver. You don't want to hear about their driving abstract and how great of a driver they are in that moment. In that moment, what you need to center is the impact of what happened. And so how can we decentralize ourselves and focus on the impact, especially when it shows up in biases? And so this looks like, when we think of the social determinants of health, of where the impact is felt, it is felt for women economically, so economic stability, social community context, our neighborhood and our environment, across our healthcare, our education system, and how this plays on an individual who is moving in the world and shaping the world. It's based around our education influences that, our race, our culture, our age, our language, gender, ability, class, sexuality, all of these things are constantly negotiating each other. And so when we think of the systems that are constantly in working at play, it's racism, sexism, classism, colonialism, and ableism, all working together. And so as we're thinking about bias, I want us to think of the impact that it has. What does the impact say? So we know that 1 in 3 girls worldwide will experience physical or sexual violence. We know that 83% of women worldwide are domestic workers. We know that the risk of maternal death is 2.7 times more higher amongst women and girls with no education. And worldwide, we see that 22% globally of women make up parliamentarians. And this continues when we look at minding some of the gender gaps, right? We see that 45.3% of women are employed, compared to 71% of men. Yet only 44.3% of women make up managers in leadership positions. This continues within the racial wage gap that we see. We see all of these things are constantly negotiating. And so when we look at this, we look at all of these things, we see that white men oftentimes are benefiting at greater degrees. And that goes all the way down with Asian men. On the dollar, we see that white men, Asian men make 96 cents on the dollar. Latino men, 92%. With white women, 90 cents. Black men, 88 cents on the dollar. Asian women, 87 cents. Latino women, 83 cents, and Black women at 79 cents within the tech industry. And so what can we do about it? Well, we need to show up as allies for women. If it is not an identity that is specific to you based on your racial position, how are you making space and creating space for women? So ally stands for, how are we always centering the impact? How are we centering those who are most at the core of the issue and wrapping ourselves in support with them? How are we listening to learn from those who are living in oppression? How are we leveraging the privileges that we have? We all carry privilege. So how are we leveraging that? And how are we creating space? How are we not working from spaces of scarcity, but actually working from spaces where we are creating abundant opportunity? Scarcity will tell us that there is not enough room at the table for all women to succeed. But abundance tells us that we can bring all of us along, and there's room at the table for everyone to thrive. And so I end with this. thinking about the ways we are centering all women's experiences to maximize our outcomes. When we are daring to challenge, when I am daring to challenge, I'm also challenging the ideas of scarcity, the ideas that tell us that there is not enough room at the table for all women, the ideas that say that we should be in competition with each other as opposed to being in collective community as well together. And I come here as one, but I stand here as 10,000. I stand on the shoulders of all of the matriarch and all of the women who have fought for me to be here in this space in this moment. So I love the principle of Ubuntu. I am because of those around me. And so with that, I thank you. I thank you as you are daring to challenge in this International Women's Day. How are you bringing other women along beside you? Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to share in space and community with everyone.